Hello and welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Nick Miles and I'm joined by our diplomatic correspondent James Landale. James, the King is in the United States. Many people have said he's going to be walking a diplomatic tightrope. What's at stake?
Well, relations between the United States and the United Kingdom at the moment are not great. There are disagreements over the war in Iran, over the future of the NATO military alliance, how much support Ukraine should have in its defence against Russia's full-scale invasion. There are disputes over trade, and the Americans have even dragged up the old issue of Britain's connections to its overseas territory of the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. So at the moment, the relationship is not great. So at stake in this state visit by the King is essentially whether or not he can take some of the heat out of the relationship and out of some of the tensions at the moment, and just put things back on a straighter keel.
So, James, can the King's visit change Donald Trump's view of Keir Starmer and the UK as a whole?
No. Donald Trump's mind is made up by Donald Trump, and it is a mind that, as we know, varies from time to time. So even if this trip goes really well and Donald Trump has a warm, fuzzy feeling about the British state and the monarch and the King, how long that sustains, I think, will be an open question. What the King can do is change the tone, can change the feel, the atmosphere, but he's not going to in any way change Donald Trump's view on the war in Iran, support for Ukraine, or anything specific like that, because that's not what the King is there to do. The King is there just to pour some oil on some troubled waters by reminding the American system and the White House and the president personally that this is a long relationship that's 2.5 centuries old. And it was forged in rebellion and war. It has had repeated rows and disputes, whether that is the protectionism of the 1930s, the entry into the Second World War, the Suez Crisis. Even Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were the closest of British and American leaders, even they fell out over the American military operation on the island of Grenada. The point the King will make is throughout all of that, the relationship has endured. And I think if he can get that idea into the mind of the White House and into the mind of the president, then that would have potentially some sustained diplomatic value. What the King will not do is change the president's minds on specific issues.
To what extent have there been examples in the past of the King appearing to push back against some of the views of Donald Trump?
Oh, the King is perfectly capable of expressing his opinion, but in a very implicit way rather than explicit way. So I don't think we're going to see any clashes, certainly in public here. He's not here to argue the government's case. He is in Washington to be as a meeting of one head of state to another. However, in recent months, for example, when Donald Trump has expressed a desire for the United States to take over control of Canada, which remember is one of the King's realms, the King has made it very clear by inviting Canadian politicians to various events and things like that of his opinion on that. And crucially, secondly, when Donald Trump recently belittled the sacrifice of British servicemen and women in the Afghanistan war, the King, we understand, made his views very, very clear in private that he considered this to be an unacceptable, sort of form of disrespect to British sacrifice.
I mean, what are the limits of royal diplomacy here?
The King is not a negotiator. He's not going to sit there and say, Mr. President, you need to change your policy on this. That's not what it's going to be about. His job will simply be to say, without being explicit, but by being implicit, look, when the UK and the US have done best together over the last 250 years, it's when they've been on the same page. There are some shared values, rule of law, democratic traditions, things like that. The first time he met a president in the Oval Office was in 1970, when he met President Nixon. So he has an awful lot of experience of UK-US relations. And also, of course, he is the direct descendant of the monarch, whose tyranny is condemned at length in the US Declaration of Independence, which this whole visit is designed to celebrate.
And it's important as well. You mentioned that there's a certain amount of stage management to this. What we're not going to see is a joint press conference. We're not going to see any meeting between the King and victims of Jeffrey Epstein. These are things that are going to be steered away from. It is very stage managed in many ways, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. But all state visits are stage managed. This one, though, slightly more so, simply because the palace, we believe, has succeeded in persuading the White House that there should be no live press conferences. In other words, those famous moments when leaders are sat next door to the president in the Oval Office and the cameras are there and the media and away they go. That is, as far as we understand, is not going to happen. Who knows what will happen? There's always the possibility for those plans to change. But the design is to minimise the political risk. And the thing is, the president, I think we're led to believe, understands that somehow the king is separate to politics. And on the evidence of the two state visits by Mr. Trump to the United Kingdom, he has always attempted to sort of follow the rules and doesn't want to be seen in any way to break those rules. Whether that survives on his home turf, we shall see.
It is not popular amongst some people in the United Kingdom for the king to go there in the first place. Are there political risks for him?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the palace is acutely aware that you're right, that too much flattery for the president would be perhaps not a good thing. But on the other hand, it is not the job of the British monarch to choose which heads of state from other countries he engages with. That is something, he is there and has been, and the palace has made this very explicit, that the king is there at the request of the British government. So it's not a decision that the king has made to go to the United States. And I think that distinction, is one that they will try to maintain throughout this trip. That it's one thing to maintain good relations with the United States, but it's the other to be seen to get too close to a president who is unpopular amongst in the minds of many British voters.
Some people in Britain would like to think that there is a so-called special relationship still existing between London and Washington. To what extent do people in America and in the minds of Donald Trump, does there still exist this special relationship?
Well, look, when other heads of state come to the White House, there is always talk about the unique relationship or the long-standing relationship or the powerful relationship. Look, people find their own adjectives. The special relationship is by and large something that has been put to bed. In American eyes, it sort of looks a bit needy. And America's, the difference in status of power between the United Kingdom and the United States has been apparent, for many, many years. So I think what is different about the UK and the US is that obviously the UK is the former colonial power. And there are many Americans, who still look back to the UK as something that they have an engagement with, a link to. But what's really interesting is that, there are different views within that. There are some within the American community who look to the UK as a voice of the Anglosphere, sort of modern Protestant Northern European country with whom they can have a sort of link. Others in the MAGA camp in the United States kind of look upon, at times the UK slightly as a sort of perhaps a slightly more old-fashioned fantasy view, historical view from films and television shows of, Downton Abbey and things like that, that is a little bit of a fantasy view of the UK. And they have repeatedly made it clear that they think the UK is going to the dogs because it's not been run properly. They oppose the multicultural nature of the UK at the moment. They say that there's too much immigration. There's lots of misinformation about the scale of crime in London and things like that has been part of the tensions between the UK and the US, particularly from the supporters of Donald Trump and the MAGA crowd, that has been based on a mistaken view of the UK. And I think that's something that the question will be, having a hereditary monarch go to the United States, will that counter that impression? I'm not sure.
But the man whose opinion matters most, Donald Trump's, he's very keen on meeting a monarch. He sees it as a great example of his status, being in a room with a monarch like the king. It's his opinion that really matters, and having a conduit in the room with Donald Trump is incredibly important, not just for Britain, but for perhaps other countries around the world. They'd love messages to be got through to Donald Trump that can't be got through in any other way.
Look, I think it's absolutely right that the UK has an extraordinary advantage here in having a monarch and a head of state who is close to Donald Trump at a time when Donald Trump is losing friends fast amongst his former Western allies. You see the Germans, you see the Italians, you see the French and others, all more willing to speak out. That era of trying to please Donald Trump that characterised the diplomacy of the first few months of this second term of office for him has now been replaced by a much more robust willing to counter and challenge and push back against the views of the White House. We've seen that has costs in terms of the state of the relationship between the UK and the US, for example, at odds over Iran. But having a monarch who can go back there and perhaps put a little bit of weight on the other side of the scale is no bad thing. The test will be this. If this trip goes well, and if there are lots of warm words and nice pictures and pictures of American politicians applauding him in Congress and things like that, if everything goes well, the test will be, can both governments leverage that soft power into something more meaningful afterwards? Because if in a couple of weeks Donald Trump is once again bad-mouthing the British Prime Minister about a policy disagreement, then questions will be asked, what was the point of this state visit? Where was the real impact of this soft power diplomacy?
Thanks, James. That was the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. And if you want to hear more from the Global News podcast, just click the link below. Thanks for joining us.